We have a housing crisis in this country. Every day that this crisis persists, people's ability to choose the life that they want to live is eroded. It's an unacceptable situation. We all know that there's few things as important as having a place to live, a place to be safe and secure and healthy, a place to raise, protect and nurture your family. We also know that when a person does not have adequate housing, many aspects of life are that much harder. Being able to secure and maintain a job is very difficult. Enrolling and sending children to school is a challenge. Just being able to adequately prepare food for your family becomes a struggle. Things which many of us take for granted every day are incredibly difficult for those people who do not have secure housing. Housing is a human right, not a privilege. Home ownership is increasingly out of the reach of younger and less wealthy Australians. More young Australians are continuing to rent well into their 30s and into their 40s. Nearly a quarter of couples who started their family more than 5 years ago are still renting. Single mothers are now more likely to be in a private rental than not, which is a big change from 20 years ago. People with a disability also face increasing challenges in finding and securing a home. Older women are one of the fastest growing cohorts now facing homelessness. The Grattan Institute recently predicted that the share of over 65s who own their home will fall from 76% today to 57% by 2056. Today's older renters risk joining tomorrow's renting retirees, nearly a half of whom live in poverty. Their numbers will only grow in the future as fewer retirees own their homes. Older Australians who don't own their home when they retire are often doubly punished because they are affected by the age pension asset test, which ignores housing equity but does capture other savings. And rent assistance, paid to pensioners who rent, remains woefully inadequate, even after the recent 15% increase. The frustrating truth is that solutions are available when we have political will to do so. And we can see the answer to that when we look at how we were immediately and effectively able to house the homeless during the COVID pandemic, only to turn them back onto the streets once the worst acute phase of that pandemic passed. There can be no pretence that there are immediate solutions for supplying housing at scale. This is a wicked problem which has had decades to develop. But we do need to attack this problem as a matter of urgency on as many fronts as possible. This Help to Buy program will help house more than 40,000 people. It will fund 10,000 homes a year for 4 years. The bill establishes a shared equity program addressing the fact that many people looking to buy a home cannot save enough money for their deposit. The program will enable certain low to middle income earners to purchase new or existing homes by obtaining an equity contribution from the federal government. That is, the purchaser and the government will effectively be co-owners of the property. A prospective purchaser will need a deposit of at least 2% of the purchase price. Eligibility for the program is limited to individuals with an individual income of less than $90,000 or couples with a joint income of less than $120,000. The federal government will provide 40% of the property's purchase price for a new home built and up to 30% of the purchase price for an existing home. The purchaser will pay the stamp duty and will arrange the mortgage for the remainder of the purchase price, but will not require lender's mortgage insurance. And while purchasers remain in the Help to Buy scheme, they should have lower repayments. The government won't charge rent, and the purchaser will not have to pay any interest to the government for its equity contribution. But the government will take a second mortgage over the property as security over its equity contribution. We know that there's a considerable disparity between housing prices in different parts of the country, so property price caps for the scheme will differentiate between states and territories and between urban regional areas and the rest of the state territory. For example, the price cap in urban Victoria is $850,000 and for the rest of the state, $750,000. The purchaser will need to live in the home, not to rent it out or to use it as an investment property. They can't already own other land or property, either in Australia or elsewhere, but they do not need to be a first-home buyer. This is important because it means that people who have co-owned but then sold properties, for example, as part of a divorce settlement, and we know that people who are divorced in middle to late life often struggle to buy for property subsequent to that, will be able to access the program. When a participant sells a property, they will need to repay the government, subject to some provisions around improvements, which I'll refer to shortly. If a person sells a dwelling for $1 million and the government has a 30% equity stake, the purchaser will need to repay the government $300,000 upon settlement, even if the initial stake was less than that. This is unless the purchaser has already bought some of the equity back from the government prior to the final sale of the property. There are stipulations in the legislation regarding compulsory buyback of the government's share if participants' pay increases above the borrowing threshold. Deputy Speaker, there has been some debate as to whether or not this program will push up house prices. Many say that 40,000 homes is not nearly enough, and sadly that is true. Most agree, though, that given the relatively small number of homes in the program, it is unlikely that will have any significant inflationary effect on house prices, although it's important to note that a substantially expanded scheme, should one be launched by the government, would materially boost demand for housing and therefore also house prices, and hence could prove both inflationary and counterproductive. It is my view that there is much to be done, and that this program is sadly only a very small part of a very large puzzle of housing, but it is one that will have a significant impact on the lives of the more than 40,000 people who might otherwise have little to no chance of purchasing a home. I hear from those people in my electorate office every week. I talk to them on the streets of my electorate, and I understand that Australians, most of us share the dream, the great Australian dream, of home ownership, and that is something which has for many, many people, including my constituents, become just a dream in recent years. But that's not to say that this program could not be better. The income thresholds of the scheme are probably too high. About 70% of working singles earn less than $90,000 a year. That's a very significant proportion of the population. And 39% of couples earn less than $120,000. This scheme shouldn't be available to people who are on above average incomes, people who have a good chance of purchasing a home anyway. It should be reserved for those people who have very little chance of doing so without assistance. Also, the entry requirement of a 2% deposit, rather than the 5% suggested by experts like the Grattan Institute during the development of this policy, increases the risk of borrowers falling into negative equity should house prices fail. Deputy Speaker, I've spoken before in this place about the critical need to maintain faith in our democratic institutions and the important role, the vital role that parliamentary oversight plays in that maintenance of transparency. It's disappointing that yet again with this legislation we hear that most of its detail will be buried in the delegated regulations, in this case the so-called program directions. Much of that program's detail remains unclear. For example, what happens if the value of the home declines? Granted, that's unlikely in the current environment, but who will bear the cost should that happen? And what about the cost of improvements to the home which increase its value? I'm informed that the program directions will contain a carve-out for renovations such that the government's equity interest will not share in those benefits. But aren't these the kind of complicated details that we should see in the primary legislation? Wouldn't it be useful to have those program directions now with the main part of the legislation as we vote on the bill? The Speaker before me, the member for Macon, said that we can leave it to the government, that we can trust the government, but we're here for a reason, and that is to provide oversight over important allocations. This is a $25 billion scheme. We deserve to know the details of it and to have a chance to examine those details at the appropriate time, which is now. Moreover, yet again, we see that the program directions contained in the regulations are not disallowable. We can't dispute them, and they are not subject to sunsetting provisions. My crossbench colleague, the member for Wentworth, will propose that this be amended, and I will support her amendment. We need to enhance oversight, not diminish it. And in doing so, we need to avoid the cynical political manipulation that occurs or can be perceived to occur when important decisions are made behind closed doors. Transparency matters, and with an expensive, important scheme like this, the Parliament and the people deserve transparency and clarity regarding process and policy. Speaker, this is a big step towards helping some Australians who are struggling. It remains to be seen if the shared equity model adopted in this bill is further developed or will remain limited to its current form. But what is certain is that it is past time that this government took substantial long-term action to fix a housing crisis which has been decades in the making. Politics shouldn't be about the next election. It should be about the next generation. For too long, Australian governments have thought more about their own future and less about the country's when it comes to housing. I'm glad we're taking action on this. It has to change. I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that this bill